it is impossible for the political system to steer a developed society. So my argument will be that in the strict sense of the term, it's impossible for the political system to steer a developed society. And it is, of course, political policies do impact and shape society. But I will argue that it's difficult for the state to shape society in a controlled manner. And to the extent that states will try to gain more control, it's actually enormously damaging to society. Now, on this picture we see the west gate of Peking University. I've been a postdoc at Peking University for 2 years. I'm now transitioning to the University of Bonn in Germany. And the reason I use this picture is because of the stone lion on the next to it. There are 2 stone lions. And these lions represent the domination of the state over the people and the earth. So the little ball pressed into the ground by the lion's claws represents the world. And I will get back to this. So, can politics steer society? The metaphor of the captain steering the ship has been a very commonly used metaphor for describing the role of politics in society. It was used in some version by Plato, Cicero, Thomas Aquinas, Jean Bodin, George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and Mao Zedong. Now it's important to realize that these authors didn't mean the exact same thing when they talked about steering society. Because in modernity, steering society has a very different meaning from the meaning it had in pre-modern societies. So in pre-modern societies, states do not have large bureaucratic machineries. The ability for the state to interfere in society, to steer society, to control society is much lower. To shape society, I should say, is much lower. So when in pre-modern authors talk about politics as the captain of society, they're thinking of interventions which take place once in a while, declaring a war, making peace, building a new temple. The state is a decision maker, and once in a while the state makes an important decision. The modern meaning is much more extensive. In the modern meaning, steering society means continuous progress through social engineering. So, of course, pre-modern societies also try to make improvements, but the idea of continuous progress, I should have probably written it with a capital P, is central to modernist ideology, and social engineering is only possible in the context of a modern nation state. Pre-modern societies didn't really have the equipment for significant social engineering. Now, social engineering has a very negative connotation in English, and this is for good reason, because in the 20th centuries there has been enormous catastrophes with social engineering. But still, all modern societies commit the sin of social engineering, at least occasionally. Now, I'm going to argue that the pre-modern authors who used the metaphor of the captain steering the ship, that was rather innocent. But I'm going to argue that in its modern version, it can be a very misleading picture and potentially dangerous. Now, I argue that in steering in the modern sense, steering in the sense of continuous progress through social engineering, is impossible. It's impossible because you cannot steer in a controlled manner, and because you cannot steer in a society-wide manner. Control is vital to steering. So if someone is steering a car, if they steer to the left, the car goes to the left. If they steer to the right, the car goes to the right. If you have a car where if you steer left, it sometimes goes to the left, but not always. And if you steer to the right, it sometimes goes to the right, but not always, and sometimes there are unanticipated consequences of your steering, then you're not really steering. Also, steering implies that a larger object is giving guidance from a single point. So if you're in a car and there are 4 people steering at the same time, then no one is actually steering. Steering implies you're steering from one point. So political players can steer things in politics, but I would argue that they cannot steer the whole of society. There will always be parts of society which are autonomous, outside of politics, and cannot be directly guided by the political center. So steering is, of course, if you can use the term in a loose sense, then you can say, okay, once in a while politics steers something. But if you talk about it in a strict sense, steering means having a large degree of control, which means that you have a good understanding of the consequences of your actions. It means that you know how to avoid unintended consequences of state intervention. And I would argue that's not possible. And I'm arguing that because of the pluralism of society, you cannot direct society from any single point. So even if politics steers something in society, it never steers the whole of society. So in this presentation, I will first give an outline of the general discussion regarding state interventionism and the difficulties steering society. Second, I will zoom in on what's the most fundamental reason for the difficulty of steering society, which is that modern societies are complex. They have differentiated into semi-autonomous fields. And this functional differentiation process, where society breaks into separate fields, religion, state bureaucracy, education, journalism, the military, art, this differentiation process is the main provider of complexity. And it's the main reason why there are strict limits as to the extent to which the state can consciously steer society. And finally, I will discuss the case of China, which is a country which has a tradition of totalitarian politics and is still in the grips of a political system that's extremely expansionist, leaves little room for society, tries to exert enormous control, and thereby does enormous damage to freedom, creativity, and the dynamism of society. So the argument would be pluralism, the pluralism of society, the pluralism of semi-autonomous fields is the main reason, the most fundamental reason why there are limitations to the shaping of society by the state. And in insofar, and that some states will be tempted to break this pluralism, and China does that to a large extent. And to the extent it does that, I will show that it does enormous damage to society. So, the direct political and historical context of this discussion is the failure of communism. Communist regimes were the most dedicated to the ideal of social engineering. And communist states have failed catastrophically. Now, there's also a discussion about the social welfare state in Western countries. This discussion is ongoing and much more nuanced. Whereas the failure of communism is clear, straightforward. The status of Western social welfare states is still under discussion, and there are different positions taken by different theorists, by different politicians. It isn't so clear what the right answer is. For some people, Sweden is the ideal state. For other people, it's the United States. You have people more liberals who believe in a smaller state. You have social democrats who believe in a slightly larger state. In the theoretical discussion, some of the main theorists would be Karl Mannheim, Karl Popper, and Friedrich von Hayek. Mannheim wrote in the early 20th century, sociologist, and he believed in holistic societal planning and saw this as an inevitable outcome of Enlightenment rationalism. The idea of the Enlightenment is to rationalize society, and the social engineering by the state, holistic societal planning, is for Mannheim simply an inevitable outcome. Now Popper, coming from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, believes in piecemeal muddling through. That is, Popper believes that the holistic societal planning is very dangerous and doesn't take into consideration that usually when the state interferes in a domain in society, the state action will have unintended consequences. So Popper believes that the state should make small adjustments while very conscious of the fact that effects on society often have unintended consequences. The state should constantly take in feedback, learn from its mistakes, and be quick to adjust when new facts emerge. So it's a kind of middle position. And then all the way on the more skeptical side is Hayek, who believes that modern societies are so complex and an individual human being is so thoroughly lacking in knowledge that it's just vanity to think that you can guide society using the state, and it's an extremely damaging and misleading idea. Now, to be clear, this presentation won't actually directly take a position in this discussion. So I'm not going to argue that the social welfare state is a bad idea, or that our state bureaucrats are incompetent, which they're not, or that the United States is a better country than Sweden. My goal will rather be to analyze why it is difficult to steer. Now, of course, if you think a lot about, so that it's difficult because society is enormously complex, and because of this complexity, when you interfere somewhere in society, your actions usually have unintended and unforeseen consequences. Now, it's important to realize that sociologists who are very aware of this problematic can still fall into different camps politically, right? So you have sociologists who are very aware of the complexities and the unintended consequences of state actions and still strongly believe in a large welfare state, right? So this discussion, this analysis doesn't directly translate into a political position, right? So we have some distance from the political discussion. But of course, if you think a lot about the complexities of societies, the natural tendency is to be a little bit more skeptical when it comes to state intervention. So I will give you some examples, and I'll try to draw on extreme examples to illustrate the case of unintended consequences by state action. So first, causal chain effects. So your actions, the actions of the state, start a causal chain, which often cannot be known in advance. So you set certain forces in motion, which the state can't control and which it wasn't aware existed. So to give you an extreme example, the Four Pests campaign of Maoist China. So in 1958, the Mao released a new policy. They were going to eradicate rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows from China. They were going to kill these annoying animals. Rats and mosquitoes because they spread diseases. Flies because they were annoying. And sparrows because sparrows eat fruits, seeds, and grain. So they lowered agricultural output. Now, brilliant plan, Communist Party. We're going to eradicate these four animals. Now, perhaps it's hard to believe, but millions of Chinese people went through China, were mobilized to kill sparrows. And different cities and provinces held competitions with each other. So they were counting the number of flies killed, counting the number of rats killed, counting the number of sparrows killed. And they were doing competitions with each other. And millions of people who were hunting these sparrows. They were killing the eggs, they were shooting the sparrows from the air, and they brought pots and pans and drums. And a lot of Chinese people, so throughout China, people were making loud noises. And when these sparrows were flying, whenever they tried to take a rest, Chinese would hit their drums and their pots and their pans, and then the natural instinct of the sparrow is to fly away again. And they would keep doing this until the sparrows would get so exhausted that they would literally fall out of the sky. And apparently, so they mobilized millions of people to do this. But in 1960, the Communist Party had an insight, because it turned out that sparrows eat grasshoppers, and there was a huge grasshopper plague in China because most of the sparrows had been killed. So now no one. So there were too many grasshoppers now, and the amount of agricultural output that was destroyed by the grasshopper plague was much more than was originally destroyed by the sparrows, and it further aggravated the already ongoing famine caused by Chinese Communist Party policies. So what plays a large role in aggravating this issue and making sure that states have trouble responding to unintended consequences is the dynamical false feedback. I will give you an example of the same period. So the Great Leap Forward, which was the larger campaign of which the Four Pests campaign was just one part, was an attempt by the Communist Party to catch up with Great Britain and the United States in terms of industrial and agricultural output. So for around China, officials were ordered to drive up agricultural production and industrial production in their city, in their province. Now, the way most Chinese officials, or at least a lot of Chinese officials reacted, was by inflating the numbers. Because you couldn't tell no to the revolutionary leadership. So you said yes. Now the result was that the grain production numbers were greatly inflated. So local officials would lie about how much grain their village produced. City officials would lie about how much grain the city produced. Provincial officials would lie about how much the province produced, etc. And everyone kept adding to the illusion. And in the end, so after a few years, or 1 or 2 years, the political center learned that grain production had, I don't know what it was, increased by 10 times, or it was a very large increase, unrealistically large. Now this was very damaging because what they decided was, well, if there's so much excess grain being produced, we should export some of the grain we have. Plus, a lot of those people who are now working in agriculture should be reassigned to industry. So they started reassigning farmers to industry. And they started exporting grain and storing grain in storages. Now, if the official numbers are 10 times exaggerated, and the state takes 10% of what the province has produced, it means that people have nothing to eat. 30 million people starved to death. Cannibalism was widespread on the countryside, so people ate old people, and beggars and weak people. They were whoever collapsed was like, yeah. There was even cannibalism ongoing. Also happened in North Korea more recently, by the way. So it was extremely dramatic. Now it took a very long time for someone for the feedback to reach the top, right? And at some point, a high official actually traveled into the countryside, realized that everyone was starving, running directly counter to the official numbers and narrative of extreme abundance. This man was Peng Dehuai, and he brought it up to Mao, and he was thinking that because he had great revolutionary credentials, he could get away with it. Of course, he was purged, so the messenger was shot, not literally shot, but he was pushed aside politically. Eventually, the policies changed. But before the policies changed, 30 million people starved. Now, these were some extreme examples from one of the most dysfunctional party states in the world. But even in highly functional state bureaucracies, it's very hard for the state to have full control over its own operations. Because even if you organize something well on the level of the nation state, a country is integrated into a global world, and the global environment provides disturbances. So a good example of this is recently in Sweden. Of course, Sweden is known for its extensive social welfare state. It's in fact famous, and it's famous for its social welfare state, and it's admired around the world to some extent. But then when the migration crisis hit Europe, because of wars in the Middle East in part and poverty in Africa, and millions of migrants were coming into Europe, unanticipated to a large extent. Many of those went to Sweden exactly because Sweden offers such great social welfare services, right? Now, what happened is that the migration-related costs, education-related costs, healthcare-related costs in Sweden are exploding. Around 500,000 people came to Sweden since 2012 on a population of 7 million. Of those 500,000 immigrants, some are from Denmark, but most are from Northern Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. The third largest city of Sweden, Malmö, is now 43%. The population consists of 43% foreign-born migrants, and well, my assumption would be that the state planners of Malmö and Sweden are very competent people, and but as a nation state, especially a small nation state like Sweden, these are the kind of disturbances you can't prepare for. These are unanticipated, and you cannot anticipate this on a national level. Like a nation state cannot anticipate on these kinds of effects. So finally, social welfare is of course meant to create more equality of resources among a population. So it's de-stratificatory. It decreases the stratification in society. That's the purpose. But sometimes, in some cases, social welfare does the opposite of what it's trying to do. So sometimes social welfare policies have stratificatory effects. That's because bureaucratic complexity burdens to a disproportional effect poorer and less educated people. Because if the system becomes more complex, then the more educated and more resource-rich people will be better able to use the system, better able to use the government policies. Whereas the people who are struggling the most, and for whom the policies are often intended, are often not aware the policies exist, and often lack the intellectual, educational resources to make full use of the policies. So I'm going to quote from a Dutch study on poverty. Ingewikkelde wetgeving verhoogt de kans op niet-gebruik. So complex legislation increases the chance that people for whom the legislation is intended will not make use of it. Ingewikkelde aanvraagformulieren dragen bij aan een hoger niet-gebruik. So complex forms, complex questionnaires contribute to people not making use of social welfare policies. Cliënten die een onjuiste perceptie hebben van hun rechten, of zelfs niet van het bestaan van de regeling weten, angst hebben voor stigmatisering, moeite hebben met het invullen van formulieren en eerder negatieve ervaringen hebben opgedaan, geven een hoge score van niet-gebruik te zien. In dit licht is het niet verwonderlijk dat het niet-gebruik bij laag opgeleiden het hoogst is. So because lowly educated people are less aware of their rights, have more negative experience, are less capable of filling out complicated forms, they are also the people who use government policies the least. So to sum up, we have causal change, false feedback, global environment of the nation state, and stratificatory effects of social welfare. Now, I would say that in addition, complicating factors that limit the extent to which a state can shape society are imperfect knowledge, state imperfect knowledge. Sorry, imperfect knowledge. The state just doesn't know a lot of things, and sometimes it lacks vital information. Well, that's clear. State bureaucratic autonomy. Officially, or in a rather simplistic vision of what a state bureaucracy does, the state bureaucracy is simply the servant and the executor of the political field. The political field makes the political decisions. The state bureaucracy executes them. It seems very simple, but in reality, the state bureaucracy consists of a at least partly separate elite. To a large extent, especially in Western countries, the state bureaucracy and the political field have differentiated. That means that the top state bureaucrats form a different group of people with different values, different from the political elite. And also they have slightly different tasks. So the state bureaucratic autonomy means that political decisions that move through the state bureaucracy will be refracted, transformed by the internal autonomous dynamic of the state bureaucracy. There's a whole television series that plays on this, Yes Minister. It's a great series. It's very, very funny, and it constantly plays on this tension between the state bureaucracy and politics, and the illusion of the state bureaucracy as being the mere servant of politics. And finally, of course, we have corruption as a complicating factor. Well, of course, that's clear, right? If your state officials and the officials of the state bureaucracy and your teachers and your police chiefs are not actually fulfilling their tasks, they're corrupt, and then it's clear that you have limitations set to the extent to which you can shape society using the state. Now, this is just a list I came up with in preparation for this talk. So I don't think that this exhausts the whole topic domain. There will be more factors. My argument is, however, that the most fundamental factor is the pluralism of a functionally differentiated society. This is the main source of complexity in modern societies, and it's also feeding into most of the factors I already mentioned. So the causal chain will be complicated when it crosses field boundaries. False feedback is often the result of the boundaries between functionally differentiated fields. The global environment of the nation state. Globalization is the globalization of a functionally differentiated world society. So all major fields in our society have become global fields. Imperfect knowledge, often also the consequence of the political field not knowing enough about another semi-autonomous field in society. And finally, state bureaucratic autonomy is of course one of these fields which have differentiated out of politics and have a degree of autonomy. Now, there are two main ways in which the pluralism of a functionally differentiated society complicates state-led social engineering. First, by the transformations provided by the semi-autonomous fields. So whenever a policy crosses field boundaries, it will undergo transformations. The line is disrupted. Second, society provides its own independent leadership. Insofar as societal fields are autonomous also from the state, they have their own dynamic, they have their own agency, and they provide their own leadership. Now again, this is crucial to the matter of steering, because it means that there's a lot of. It means that a pluralistic society cannot be led from a single point. It means that all the different societal fields in civil society, education, state bureaucracy, religion, journalism provide their own leadership, at least to a significant extent. So what you will have is you have these fields standing next to each other and they're talking past each other to some extent. So politics is often concerned with the economy. Politicians talk a lot about the economy, especially American politicians. They always talk about the economy. They've often studied economics in college. They read up on business news. Now, business leaders often know a great deal about politics. They read the newspapers, they read political news, and yet, as systems, these systems often talk past each other. So when they talk about the economy, they actually approach it from different angles. And to some extent, they're talking past each other. So politics will talk about the unemployment rate. That's relevant to politics, because high unemployment rates can have negative electoral consequences for the government in the upcoming elections. Household income is politically relevant. GDP growth, politically relevant. Now, none of that is actually relevant to business decisions. You will think business will be concerned with profit margins, brand value, stock value. Businesses will create jobs, they will hire people, but they're not concerned with the overall unemployment rates of the country. They're not concerned with average household income in the country. They're not really concerned with GDP growth. Of course, in a flourishing economy, their companies tend to do well, but they're not necessarily interested in GDP growth per se. Now, even though you have this separation, politics will often falsely try to take credit for things that come out of the business world. So when unemployment rates are decreasing, the government will often pretend that its policies are to be credited. When the unemployment rate is rising, the opposition will often use this as an argument as to why the opposition policies would be better than that of the current government. Same with GDP growth. Now, politician and sociologist Pim Fortuyn was assassinated a little over 10 years ago. Always used to reply with the phrase, "Waar staat die banenmachine dan?" Where is that job machine? So whenever politics try to take credit for a lowering of the unemployment rates or for a flourishing economy, Pim Fortuyn would say, where is that job machine? Now, of course, states can provide jobs in the public sector. And some states have tried to lower the unemployment rate by inflating the public sector. States such as Greece in recent decades. That is, of course, works in the short run, but it's of course extremely damaging in the long run, and not a viable strategy for the long run at all. In the long run, job creation comes out of business. Now, of course, politics will shape the conditions under which business operates. So yes, governments can have more effective economic policies or less effective economic policies. That's clear, right? But especially in a country like the Netherlands, a small country, the main ups and downs in terms of GDP growth, in terms of unemployment rates, are caused by the global market. The electoral cycle doesn't have such an obvious and direct impact. So whether there's a coalition between PvdA and VVD, or whether it's with the CDA or D66, whatever the current government happens to be, it's not as if every time we have a new government, every time we have a new coalition, suddenly the economic conditions change. Like the major changes, the major ups and downs are caused by the global market. So it's not that the political system can do better or can do worse, right? You can have more successful economic policies or less successful economic policies. But in any case, the politics is often exaggerating its own role for opportunistic reasons, and also because the population looks for political leadership and likes the illusion of a political center that's guiding the economy. Now, politics will even pretend to plan innovation. You will hear phrases such as, we stimulate innovation in business and technology. Well, true innovation cannot be planned. True innovation cannot be anticipated. If something is really new, you cannot know about it before it's there. And certainly the political field cannot know about it before it's there. But you will still hear that phrase, where we're an innovation-friendly party. Of course, political parties and political field can disrupt the ability of other fields in society to provide innovation. That's true. I mean, the Communist Party of China is has for decades been suppressing the innovative abilities of society. But politics cannot positively, directly impact the rate of innovation in a positive sense. It cannot create innovation. Like Apple innovates. It's not the White House doesn't innovate. The White House can say that Apple innovated because the White House was doing so great. But that's mostly an illusion. So, but I'm not an economist, so I will focus on an example now which is more close to home, to the university. I use the university icon from SimCity because it's a game I love to play, and it's one of the main reasons why I began to be interested in sociology. And it's also because SimCity has this great God perspective, right? So SimCity is a totalitarian society, right? It has a kind of God emperor who makes everything happen in society. So there we have the university. Now the important thing to realize about the university is that the university is located in two separate fields, in the education field and in the field of science or scholarly research. It's a structural coupling between these two fields. Now, formally, it works like this. Politics, of course, having it formed itself to some extent, makes policies. It gives the orders to the state bureaucracy. The state bureaucracy executes the orders. So, for instance, politics may want academic excellence in research and education. We have some version of that. Different parties will have their slogan. But the politics wants to improve education, improve science, right? So some version of that is gonna be ordered to the state bureaucracy. The state bureaucracy is going to execute it, and is then going to test whether it's actually working, and then feeds back the information to politics, telling their masters whether the plan worked or not. But regretfully, it doesn't work in reality, it doesn't work that way. First of all, there is a refraction, there's a transformation when the line goes from politics to the state bureaucracy. Politics talks in terms of rather vague and general value statements. Bureaucracies cannot directly implement them. They have to turn it into a form that's practically applicable. They have to manage a complex bureaucratic machinery. They have to divide the tasks over different agencies, different groups, different individuals with different mandates. So there's a holism to this political value statements, academic excellence, educational fairness, like whatever the ideal is, there's a kind of holism to it. But state bureaucracies cannot work with that holism. They decompose it. They have to cut it up in parts. And by cutting it up in parts, they're often already violating against the ideal. Like ideals are not naturally transformable into decomposed units. And then, of course, finally, what politics is asking for and what education and scholarly research are striving for is quality. The state bureaucracies can't work with quality. They work with quantity. They need quantitative criteria as to what the plan is, as to test whether the plan has been executed, as to test to what extent the criteria are met. So let's say politics says we want better universities. We want more students. We want more students. We want more highly educated people in the Netherlands and in Europe. And we want more research, more innovation, more knowledge society. Okay, the state bureaucracy says, okay, we got it. In terms of education, output financing. The faculty will get paid, in the Netherlands at least, for how many students it delivers, how many students graduate, right? And in terms of scholarly research, papers in top journals. Now, why? These are quantitative criteria. Why papers? Because books, some books are very important, some books are not very important, some books are thick, some books are thin. Paper is the academic papers and journal papers, are much more standardized units and therefore easier to quantify than essays, lectures, and books, right? And then, of course, the journals can be ranked. You put numbers on the quality of the journal. So these are kind of measures. These are quantitative measures that pretend to be qualitative measures, or they pretend to quantify quality, which is not actually possible, right? So the quantitative measures are supposed to stand in for the qualitative measures. It's like, we publish papers in top journals. The top journals are high on the list. So how many papers? 500. Okay, it must be a high quality department. All right. Now, what actually happens when these things hit the autonomous dynamism of the education field and field of scholarly research? So one of the things that happens, at least people tell you that who have been working in education, in higher education for a long time in the Netherlands, is that they often lower the standards for graduation. Yes, you get paid for, the faculty gets paid for how many students it delivers. You don't want to fire, you don't want to get, lose your job. You don't want to lose some of your colleagues who you like so much and who you have worked with for years. So they lower the standards a little bit. Some students who wouldn't make it without output financing, no, they're kind of mediocre student, it's okay. So the real effect is lowering of the standards. Now, can bureaucracy see that? No, bureaucracy can't see that. The only thing that bureaucracy sees is the quantitative output. Now, what's the effect of the papers, right? Neglect of other type of publications. As a scholar, if you publish a lot of essays and books, it's not good for your career. You have to publish these papers because they're a more quantifiable unit. So that's what the state bureaucracy wants. Internationally, not just in the Netherlands. That's what the globalized academic system wants now. And of course, there's some parts of the university which are less well adapted to the journal paper culture, such as the humanities, or the humanities in particular, right? So for the humanities, reviews and essays are tremendously important. Discussions are tremendously important. Papers are it's more of a natural science model. It's less fruitful for the humanities to have this extreme focus on papers in academic journals. So people know that to some extent, but what are you going to do? This is the system, right? But now comes the trick. Because now, the state bureaucracy only sees the success. It doesn't see the qualitative problems. It only sees the quantitative improvements. And of course, the university is improving because it's adapting to the criteria that are set by the state bureaucracy. But therefore, this adaptation process, which is actually coming out of the autonomous dynamic of these fields, is actually tricking the state bureaucracy to some extent, right? But they love to be tricked because they speak their own language. and then the state bureaucracy passes it on to politics. And politics just has these numbers, right? And then they play their political games with it. They're going to try to get political advantage out of it. Look, under our governance, the higher education in the Netherlands has climbed the rankings by 3 positions. But you will have a back and forth in politics. But to a large extent, these fields are actually talking past each other. Now, so the fundamental complexity derives from the field-differentiated pluralism. In modern societies, you will have a plurality of fields standing next to each other: education, journalism, religion, politics, medicine, law, intimate relationships, art, scholarship, the economy. Those are the ones that are in the above graph by a Lumanian sociologist, which is the leading school of social differentiation theory. The military and the state bureaucracy should also be added, I argue, and also sports is its own field. And perhaps, but that's my suggestion, the intelligence community, intelligence agencies. Now, the important thing to realize is that this functional differentiation of semi-autonomous fields is building upon earlier differentiations, which we have to distinguish from each other. So 3 very important types of differentiation in sociology are segmentary differentiation, stratificatory differentiation, and functional differentiation. So segmentary differentiation is the differentiation of villages and tribes. So now we're talking thousands of years ago with the emergence of agricultural societies. Stratificatory differentiation is the differentiation of different groups in societies with its own hierarchical position. The priestly class, the warrior class, the merchant class, the farmer class, or the caste system in India, those are hierarchical orderings. That's stratification. Now, functional differentiation, you will have a situation where the differentiated fields are not above each other. They are alongside each other and have their own autonomy. So education is not above journalism, and journalism is not above the economy, and the economy is not above the state bureaucracy, and the state bureaucracy is not above the military. These have an autonomy. But it's cumulative. So all the differentiation dynamics don't disappear. They're taken into the new differentiation dynamics. So the primary the ordering principle of modern societies is functional differentiation, but stratification and segmentation are still within that functional differentiation. So each of the fields will have its own stratificatory dynamics, right? But so instead of one layered system throughout society, the functional differentiation has fragmented the stratificatory dynamics of society. So you'll have the education system. Some people are more highly educated than others. So there's a hierarchical ordering within the education system. Within the state bureaucracy, some officials will have a higher position than other officials. Within the economy, some people will be richer than other people. Now, the important thing to realize is that insofar as functional differentiation has truly pushed aside the older forms of differentiation, the reward system within each of the fields is meritocratic. It's function-based. The smartest students get the highest education. The people who are best with their money are the richest, etc. Right? But of course, the older stratification is still playing a role. So to some extent, we still have an elite, which is dividing jobs among each other. An elite which has certain forms of resources and capitalizes upon those resources in other fields, right? And then you see you see the old, more society-wide stratificatory dynamics reflected back in the fields. So insofar as that's the case, and insofar as it's exposed to be the case, our automatic judgment is that that's unfair, that's not legitimate. So there are two crucial elements as to why functional differentiation is the dominant form of differentiation and why we live in a functionally differentiated society rather than a stratificatory society or simple stratificatory society. The first is that to a very large extent the inequality in our societies is fragmented by these systems and is caused by the functional demands of these systems. Right? In that sense, we would say it's meritocratic, a meritocratic plurality of inequalities. And insofar as that's not the case, insofar as we still have an elite that's dividing the jobs, keeping people down, and manipulating the game, we say that's illegitimate. Now that's a big difference from older stratificatory societies, right? In older societies, stratificatory societies, you will have a leading caste, leading groups. They're officially leading groups. They have official privileges. So the difference with our contemporary society is such things are considered illegitimate. Yeah, so normatively, we certainly have a functionally differentiated society. Now, social differentiation theory is heterogeneous. It derives from multiple roots. So one important tradition it emerges from is that of classical political economy. Theorists such as Adam Smith, Spencer, Marx, Durkheim, and Georg Simmel noted that modern societies you had a greater division of labor, and with that came a greater division of social rules. Now, in Protestant theology, you had a parallel movement where theorists such as von Prinsterer and Abraham Kuyper noted that religions, nations, society, academia, trade, conviction, family lives, to some extent formed autonomous spheres. And they interpret this theologically. So they believe that this was the model God intended human societies to have. And it's only sinful hubris that of totalitarian projects, of revolutionary projects, that violates against this differentiation. They were reworking and expanding upon the Lutheran notion of the two kingdoms, so the two kingdoms being the church and the state, having their own field, their own autonomy, which was in turn building upon the Catholic notion of the two kingdoms. As Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this earth." Right? So there was already in the Christian tradition an important ideal concerning religious autonomy. And then Max Weber, he theorized science, politics, business, law, and art as value spheres with their own values. Now, the two most important modern schools of social differentiation theory are Pierre Bourdieu's field theory, which sees society as carved up by semi-autonomous fields of struggle. The notion was that neo-Marxists such as Bourdieu noted that capitalism wasn't the whole story. You had more differentiated fields of power. There wasn't one power game in society, one dominating factor. There were multiple dominating dynamics. So the idea is that you have capitalism in Western society as the main dominating force of power, but then along that you will have cultural fields which are semi-autonomous. And then you have in Germany based. So Pierre Bourdieu's field theory is probably the most influential worldwide and the most well known, but I would argue not the most sophisticated. Niklas Luhmann's systems theory is actually the most sophisticated theory of social differentiation. It's a school that's very influential in Germany right now, and it theorized society in terms of systems of self-reproducing binary coded communication. So these codes would be the following. Have, not have in economics. Yes. So some people have to leave right now, right? So have, not have in economics, transcendent, immanent in religion, etc. So each of these fields will have its own binary coded communication. So I'm working on my own version of social differentiation theory, which is under construction. So I'm trying to formulate my own version, which is a synthesis of earlier theories in a new combination. So I regretfully I won't have time to actually go into that. But the most important thing are the shared insights of social differentiation theory, namely that we should distinguish between the differentiation of social roles, institutions, and functional systems or fields. That functional systems or field differentiation is the most fundamental one. That each field has its own dynamics, and that each offers its own perspective. So you can look at any social phenomenon from the perspective of a particular social field. So this lecture, for instance, we can look at this lecture and ask, from a truth point of view, or from a scholarly point of view, we can ask, is this what Eric Hendriks is saying right now, is it true or not? To what extent is it true or not? But we can ask, is this a lecture profitable? Who's making money? Economic perspective. Is it legal? Is anyone breaking the law here? Legal, lawful, unlawful. Political. Is it politically good? Is it politically bad? Religious. Is it in some way religious? So you can, each of the fields offers its own perspective and has its own agency. And so each field offers a perspective for interpreting and judging social phenomena. And that creates an enormous complexity in modern societies, which states who try to steer society, or who try to at least influence and shape society, have to work with. Now what happens if a state doesn't want to work with this plurality, which sets structural limits on the extent to which it can shape society? Well, some states try to suppress and break the pluralism of a developed society, or at least limit the pluralism of society, so that the state or the political field can exert more control. This is the great temptation of the totalitarian extension of politics. Now I put a picture here of Kim Jong-un because that's of course a very extreme example, right? And North Korea does this, right? So in North Korea, all the major fields are heteronomized, suppressed by the political field in an attempt of the political field to gain greater control. So to some extent the political field actually does gain more control, but it only gains more control by suppressing society. So it's not leading society, It's not leading and steering a pluralistic society, it's suppressing a pluralistic society. And that goes all the way to intimate relationships, by the way, which are often also mandated by the church. By the state. The North Korean state will, at least in some situations, order people to get married to certain people. Now, it's important that this is not just a dynamic that plays out in clearly hyper-totalitarian societies such as North Korea. It also plays a role, to a lesser extent, in many other societies, such as China. So I lived in China for about 4 years, and 2 of those years I worked at Peking University. And China has a tradition of expansionist politics. So these are the lions I started my presentation with, the shishi. And these stone lions represent the state's domination over society. So the male lion is pressing down the earth. That's the population. That's society. The female lion has the nurturing cup, and it's a feminine nurturing that is of a rather controlling nature. And this symbolizes it. Originally, these statues come from Buddhism, but it have come in the Chinese tradition. These have come to symbolize Chinese state power. And this tradition, which is an imperial tradition, lives on in the Chinese Communist Party, which on its organizational level is a copy of the Leninist party state of the Soviet Union, but in terms of its underlying culture, is building upon this longer tradition of expansionist politics. In China, for hundreds of years, society was dominated by the central field of the scholar officials, the mandarins. And later this gave rise to, later we had a phase of totalitarian politics in Maoist China, and now contemporary China is, I argue, a semi-totalitarian. Now it's important to realize that these scholars officials, these mandarin in imperial times, were meant to be total human beings. The scholar official, the mandarin, had to be at once a bureaucrat, a politician, a scholar, an artist, a business person, a commander, a judge, and a poet. They were meant to be the experts on all higher forms of knowledge. And any independence from the central hierarchy of the mandarins was considered problematic. They left very little room in the rest of society because they wanted to concentrate all power and prestige in one elite. Well, I will skip through the examples. Now it's important to realize that early modern Europe was much more differentiated during the Ming and the Qing dynasties, so for the last few hundred years. So now contemporary China is less differentiated than Western liberal democracies, but already before the coming of Western liberal democracies and communist China, Western societies were more differentiated. So when the Qing and the Ming first came into contact with colonialist European nation states, very different kinds of entities were colliding upon each other. So this would be an ideal typical image. So in an exaggerated sense, you could say that Imperial China formed one power pyramid, whereas the European nation states formed a plurality of power pyramids, had a much greater differentiation of hierarchization. So you had different hierarchies. The hierarchies were more pluralized. So this would be imperial, but hey, this is important to realize. Even though there was a cultural domination in Imperial China that was very proto-totalitarian in a sense, very controlling, very totalizing, they didn't have the machinery of a modern nation state. So it was not, Imperial China was not a real totalitarian state, right? Because the command structures would be disrupted by bureaucratic inefficiency, but also by the Taoist principle Wu Wei, non-interference. They didn't have the ideal of continuous social engineering by a party state. That didn't exist in Imperial China. Now in Maoist China, the totalitarianism went all the way to the bottom of society. It went all the way into society. Much more penetrating, totalizing control. Now, contemporary China still has this controlling power state, but since Deng Xiaoping because they realized it's not workable, right? It's not. You need to give society some room for societal fields to professionalize according to their own principles. You have to give them some space in order to develop. You cannot modernize without pluralizing. Deng Xiaoping realized this, so they gave, since Deng Xiaoping, since the 80s, Chinese society has given a little bit more room for independent societal development. But it's still very limited and under pressure. So in the state bureaucracy, which the state bureaucracy is, just to give you some examples, the state bureaucracy is much less separate, differentiated from the political field than in Western societies. In Western societies, you have people who go into to have a bureaucratic career, you have people who go into a political career. To a large extent, those are different people. There's some overlap, but they're not fully overlapping. And so to a large extent, politics and bureaucracy are separate fields in Western society. In China, there's one path, right, in politics and bureaucracy. It leads through the Communist Party, the party state. Now, what I want to show you is that the fact that China has only partly pluralized, that is much less field differentiated than Western societies, is actually the main limitation to the development of Chinese society. So I will give you some examples, right? Because the Chinese contemporary regime is constantly in between the more pluralistic Western model and a more traditional model. So, for instance, in the military, traditionally, you have extreme political penetration. So even nowadays, the Chinese military, half of the higher officials are political commissars without a strong military expertise. So only half of the higher officials are military experts. So for every lieutenant who has a military expertise, you'll have one lieutenant who has a political expertise and has a one-on-one surveillance task on the first lieutenant. So you have one-on-one surveillance with a political commissar with a high rank checking another person of the same rank 24/7, or being responsible at least 24/7. Now, of course, it's extremely difficult when you have such a politicized military to truly professionalize. Right? So you see this in the military, but you see this in law. In law, they have the Xinfang offices, which are their old system. It's where you don't have judges and prosecutors and lawyers. Instead, somebody goes to a petition office and directly complains to a representative of the Communist Party. This is a system where politics and the legal field are highly undifferentiated. That's a traditional system, and it still exists alongside an imported legal system from the West, which, however, has only been half implemented. Because they realized that to run a modern economy, they had to have more rule of law, more autonomous legal field. If you have constant political players interfering in the law, you cannot really run a complex economy, because in a commercial environment you will have conflicts, you have contracts, so you need at least, relating to the economy, relating to commerce, you need to have some rule of law. But other parts of the law, relating criminal law or anything that's political, it's still political players and bribes which determine the outcome of cases. So it's hard in those areas. It's very hard to predict from just the content of the case what the outcome what the eventual punishment will be, right? So that is to say that you have kind of two legal systems in China. The one is not actually differentiated from the political field, and insofar as they did import a Western, more differentiated legal system, they have only half implemented it. Now, this creates like this lack of differentiation is an enormous burden. And from the outside, it can seem that actually it seems to work well. It's just the Communist Party provides a lot of guidance. But the lack of differentiation creates a lack of independent oversight. There is no oversight. So what you have is extreme fraud and power abuse. So just to give you like a little glimpse of how bad it is, criminologist Borge Bakken estimates that 97.5% of crime cases reported to the police in China are not included in the crime statistics. Now, it's important to realize we're not talking about crime that's not reported to the police. So often crimes are committed and not reported to the police. This is about cases that are reported to the police, but police officials and party officials at different levels, for opportunistic reasons, make these cases disappear from the statistics. So the statistics in China are estimated by leading criminologists to be 97.5% fabricated. So it's a complete lie. And a lot of statistics in China are complete lies, because the people who make the statistics, who gather the statistics, are the ones who benefit from the statistics being in a certain way, are the people who are evaluating themselves. So this is what you get if you have a lack of differentiation within the political field, if you have a lack of autonomy of the legal field, if the police is the police chief and the party commissars are, if that's one network, etc. Right? So this is the lack of differentiation in practice. This is what it looks like. So the Chinese Communist Party actually has two contradictory aims. Its main aim is preserving its power and control. Political control, it is, not control, not steering society, not shaping society necessarily. The Communist Party doesn't run a large social welfare state. It doesn't provide a lot of services to the citizens, but it does exert enormous political control. So sometimes this is like lacking in our discussions, because we talk about big states versus small states, right? But it's not just about big states versus small states as a percentage of the GDP, etc. It's also about what does the state actually do. So the Chinese Communist Party doesn't offer a lot of services, so it's not a big state in a kind of Scandinavian way, but it does exert enormous control that diminishes the autonomy of fields throughout Chinese society. Now, that also diminishes the ability of social fields to professionalize, to reward players within the field according to their functional criteria, according to autonomous professional criteria. And of course, professionalization is key to modernization. The states want to modernize because they want to make China big and powerful, and the states wants to exert enormous control. And these two principles are actually contradictory. And that's the constant dynamic that's playing out in China right now. China is only half integrated into the world, because world society is a functionally differentiated society. Sometimes we talk about globalization as if it's just an economic phenomenon, but even you have the globalization of every functional system. So we see the globalization of the market in economy. We see the globalization of educational principles. We see the globalization of academic research. We see the globalization of politics even. Not in the sense that we have one world state, but in the sense that the Western nation state has become a global model of legitimacy. You see, so throughout society, you have these fields, and all these functional fields are to an extent globalized. So if you suppress what I'm saying is that these two variables, the degree to which China is only half integrated into the world system, not just market-wise, but also politically, also on all levels, also academically, also in terms of journalism, in terms of the information gets getting, that variable on the one hand, and the degree of autonomy it allows society, those are not actually two separate variables. That's actually the same thing. Because insofar as you leave more room to a functionally differentiated field in society, the political system also allows that field more integration with the world system. So I will leave this slide as well. So to sum up, I make three statements. First, I say political steering in the strict sense is impossible because first, the system boundaries or field boundaries provide fundamental refractions. Second, the pluralism of a functionally differentiated society means that leadership is pluralistic. Second, political overreach stifles professionalization, creativity nationally and on the level of world society. And then thirdly, I'm going to argue that people who want to make society a better place, people who are idealistic, who are activistically minded do better to take the civil rather than the political approach. And what I mean by that, in most cases, and what I mean by, with some exceptions, and what I mean by this is that by civil activism I mean a kind of activism that works with the field differentiation. And with political activism I mean a kind of activism that works against the field differentiation. So if you're in a university, you want to make the university a better place, and you're saying, we should have better education. We should have more professors per student. If you have this kind of activism, you're actually conducting a kind of activism that's strengthening the autonomy and internal quality of the field in which you're operating. But a lot of activism actually takes a different form. It's what I call political activism. It's where people with political ideals will carry their ideals into different autonomous systems and demand that the field they're in is made more conform to their political ideals. It's understandable that people pursue this path, but it's also a dangerous path because you risk diminishing the autonomy of the field you're in, diminishing the autonomy of education, diminishing the autonomy of scholarly research, which is actually doing damage both to its creative abilities, the creative abilities of the field, and its professionalism. So if you want to decolonialize the university, right, then you're using a political ideal, you're using a political language, wait, we're almost at the question time, using a political language, and you're carrying it into another field, right? Sometimes you have to do this, but it's risky, right? So I'm just, what I'm arguing is that be cautious of this distinction, right? Because often people don't want to pursue the civil kind of activism because it sounds too small. You don't want to start with one field and improve that field from the inside. No, you want to have one blueprint for society and press that upon society because then you're doing something really big. But that's actually a kind of activism that not always, but often, or at least sometimes, actually does damage rather than good. So, thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, actually, to the last point, I thought this very interesting. Are these ideals for which people then become active always field ideals, so that you have an idea that is just concerning the field, or can these also be ideals that concern the whole society, but you just try to apply them on the field that you're in?
Yeah. So with political kind of activism, you'll have an ideal that politically can be, for instance, accepted by a large segment of society. It can be kind of commonsensical ideals, or egalitarianism, for instance. Egalitarianism is, or at least equality of opportunity, is not just a widely shared ideal, but it's one of the fundamental principles of modern democracies, right? So armed with this ideal, you can go into different fields and demand that they're made more egalitarian, right? And to some extent, that's legitimate, right? Because everyone should have the opportunity to have education, should have the right to vote. So the idea of a functionally differentiated society is that everyone has not everyone has the right or the ability to be a leading player in any of the fields, but everyone has the right to be at least to a minimal extent included. So you are not a politician, but you're included into politics as a voter, as a citizen. You're not a business person, you're not an entrepreneur, but you're included into the economy as a consumer at least, etc. Right? So you're included in many things. You are allowed to read the scientific research findings, even if you're not capable of doing your own research. Right? So this minimal participation and inclusion is key to a functionally differentiated society. Right? So to that extent, a value like egalitarianism should be applied throughout society. It's, however, if a particularly political spin is given to it, what you can have is that it turns into a kind of imperialist force. And of course, the people driving the imperialist force can fool themselves into thinking that they're just doing something good, whereas they're actually doing something bad, right? So for instance, people will want their university to be more conform to their political principles. Well, even if the political principles are fairly good, we should still respect the separation between academia on the one hand and politics on the other. So egalitarianism in a general sense is good for the whole society. But if people give particular polemical political spins to it and then carry that into different fields, that's when the imperialist movement starts to take shape, and you're actually damaging the pluralism of society.
Sorry. I have two sort of interrelated questions. The first one is, in a liberal democratic society, where does the political field come from? Because the way you're setting it up, it seems that it has its own, because it is a field, and it is so differentiated in your idea, it has its own set of rules, and it has its existence apart from other fields. It interacts with them, but it is apart from them.
Yeah.
But in a democracy, capitalist businessmen are politicians, academics are politicians, workers are politicians, etc., etc. So, to a certain extent, isn't the political a pluralist in and of itself, and therefore there isn't, like this politics coming to university. If politics was a game completely different with people all its own, like that are generated only within this system, like in China with the party officials, that would make sense. But in a liberal democracy where theoretically at least everyone can in fact be part of the political field and bring their own field notions and field struggles to politics,
they can't do that.
Sorry?
They actually can't do that. That's the interesting thing.
Right.
Because these perspectives can't actually touch each other. So you're talking from the logic of politics, or you're talking from the logic of scholarship. Like you can ask, is this true or false? Or is this politically what we want, or is this politically not what we want? Right? But these logics can't actually touch. That's the interesting thing about it. They can't touch. So you can't actually have the political field representing every other field in society. The political field actually can't really see the other fields. The political field always looks from its own perspective. Now, it's important to realize these are not people, right?
Assuming it's an autonomous field.
Sorry?
Assuming it's a fully autonomous field.
Yes, assuming it's a fully autonomous field. But it's also important to realize, well, as a logic, it's fully autonomous, but the question is to what extent is the logic materialized in a separate hierarchy with actual people? So that's an empirical question. There you can have politics being more merged with like capitalist business elites, and on the level of people and programs and institutions, things can heteronymize, right? But the logic behind it, these can't touch, right? But the question is, to what extent is the logic actually materialized in the actual institutions and people we have, right? Yeah. Now it's important to realize when I say that the politics can't actually see the other fields, right, for what they are. I'm not talking about politicians, right? It's more abstract than that. Throughout our lives, we're constantly walking through these fields. If you get sued, you're not a lawyer, but suddenly you're a player in the legal field, right? If you go out and you buy a coffee, boom, you're a player in the economic field. So even though each of the fields has a kind of professional elite that is really dedicated to that field, has a hobby to shape by that field, identifies with that field, we all move throughout all the fields all the time, right? Now, politics is in Western democracies fairly differentiated as a field from other fields. And it can't represent all the other fields. Actually, that's the old thinking, the stratificatory logic. That's the idea. There you had the idea that the leadership, the king, and his advisors represents the whole country, right? But actually, politics, the political elite, is only the elite of politics. And it's only really providing political leadership, educational leadership, business leadership, religious leadership has different origins. But politics. So the story you're telling of the political elite representing all the fields, including all the fields within its own field, that's kind of the hubris of the political field. That's the political field fooling itself, thinking that it's everything. But each of these fields has this. The political field just has more instruments to hurt other fields, so to speak. But each of the fields has this kind of narcissism, right? Where it thinks that it's everything.
Sorry, and the second part of the question, which was Thank you for that, by the way, because it clarified how you're thinking to me. But so then you were saying about the totalitarian. So there's two ways. You said there was one main way this was happening, and this was like politics getting into everything, right? How would you think about? Because it seemed to me how you were thinking about education and the relationship between politics and education. That there's at least one logic that is, well, at least as important as the political logic that seems to. I'm going to use a pejorative word, but it isn't. Infect everything else, which is the economic notion, right? So in the sense that we're in the educational field, but we have to be cost conscious, and we have to deliver brand value to our university.
Yeah.
And we have to have even the idea of qualitative measures is not necessarily only bureaucratic. I mean, it comes to bureaucracy from management, right? And so the idea that a capitalist logic of liberalism and liberal enterprise, in a sense, infects everything else as another kind of, I don't want to say totalitarianism, but total logic, or totalizing logic.
Yeah, well, I agree that I agree with that. I mean, I agree that at least theoretically, but also in practice to a large extent, we'll see that the business can disrupt other fields. I mean, perhaps theoretically, any field can disrupt any other field. It's just that certain fields are better at it, right? So yes, that's true. I think that business can corrupt politics as well. Politics can corrupt business. It can go different. It can, but as soon as usually when they start to merge, it's they're kind of corrupting each other, right? So it's like in the United States, it's unclear when we often say American politicians are a little bit corrupt because they implicitly follow the money, right, and not the voters, because they need campaign funding and super PACs, etc. But of course, you can also spin it around and saying politicians are forced. Like you can say that it's business corrupting politics, but you can also turn it around and say, okay, these businesses, the political field is so unpredictable. As a business, we feel forced to make political spendings because otherwise our business may be hurt, right? So it's kind of like, is business being extorted by politics, or is business manipulating politics? But they're kind of corrupting each other. That always happens when fields merge and they're disrupting each other's autonomous logic. Now realize, however, that an institution can be corrupted. Like people can play can play in a manipulative way, but the actual codes behind it, they can't touch, right? So the Communist Party can they can say this is true and this is false in the education system, for instance, but they cannot actually produce truth or falseness, right? Something is still, at least I would assume, something is still true or false, right? And so you can take a political logic and try to replace the true-false logic, or you can take a political logic and try to replace an economic logic, right? But then in the end, your country is actually poor, or your education is propaganda and not actually good education, right? So you can hurt another field, but you can't really erase the logic of the other field. It's always there as a kind of potential. But I agree with. I agree that there's not one perpetrator, right? It's just that it can also be the military, by the way, that interferes. But yeah, you're right that.
But sports rarely does that.
Yes.
Right. And sociology and journalism less so than the economy and politics.
Yeah, but it's not theoretically impossible. I could assume like a society in which you can only work at the University of Amsterdam if you have great athletic abilities, for instance. Then this quality field would be disrupted.
Lots of questions, but I'll just ask two maybe. One is a follow-up on your questions. Can you about the civic and political? Can you think of the political idea of preserving the kind of pluralism that you were talking about, the autonomy?
Yeah.
Can you think about it as a political idea?
Yeah.
Because in your opposition between civic and political, political is about imposing some kind of imperial logic on the whole system. But the logic can be precisely keeping those systems apart.
Yeah.
So that's one question, maybe.
Yeah. But I hope that's possible. Like, so I would be very in favor of politics of pluralism, right? And I hope that's possible. Now, Luhmann, who's the most influential social differentiation theorist, he's located in the postmodern tradition, so he's very skeptical of the actual possibilities of politics to even grasp such a thing as like preserving pluralism, right? Because he thinks that politics couldn't even fully grasp that. But I'm still hopeful that we could have some kind of, I think we can be conscious, and I think of the value of the autonomy of social fields, and steer our politics and our activism in such a way that we strengthen autonomy rather than diminish autonomy, even though it's always a very great temptation to work against autonomy of social fields.
Luhmann has some interesting idea which we could develop about the politics of tautology and paradox. So there could be a direction to be taken. But what is your account then of integration? I mean, if you say that integration in society, in this pluralistic, functionally differentiated society, doesn't come from a political system, where does it come from? Is it just a natural outcome of these autonomous systems or subsystems interacting with each other?
That's actually something I'm working on.
It's a big thing.
So yeah, it's a big theme. That's actually exactly what the project I'm working on now at the University of Bonn. So I'm trying to think of how does integration work? What's the unitary factor, right? Because Luhmann will say that we just have functional differentiation. That's it, right? Bourdieu will say, well, we have the field differentiation, but we still have like a dominating power. And that for him, in Western societies, that would be capitalism. In communist societies, that would be the state. But that provides some kind of unity, right? And I'm trying to think of the way of thinking of the unity as all the space that the fields leave open, right? So semi-autonomous fields are like partly autonomous, but they're partly heteronomous, mixed with other things, right? So what's that mixing thing? That's not the same as directly politics. That's kind of the logic of the whole, right? So the first question that was asked was about equality, right? So equality is one of those principles that's applied to all the fields, right? Not political equality, but a kind of like citizen equality, an equality of opportunity, right? That's everyone has the right to be educated. Everyone has the right to inform themselves via journalism. Everyone has the right to buy things and sell things. So I think so. I'm working on that, and that's actually the missing piece at this point. Like, how do you reconcile the fact that we have these regimes that have a unitary character? China has a unitary character. It sticks together in a certain way. It has this very strong, controlling political center, less civil society, and it then has these social networks. It's kind of glued together with all these quasi-family-based networks, right? And then you have liberal democracies, which has this pluralistic logic. But even though it's pluralistic, the logic of pluralism itself provides a kind of unity, right? So there's a logic to the way the whole is put together. And I think that's the next step in theorizing. So I want to push social differentiation theory in that direction. But I'm just a postdoc, and I've just started this project. And yesterday I was at the University of Bonn for the first time, and I discussed this with Rudolf Stichwey, who's actually one of the leading Luhmann scholars right now. So we're gonna try to work on this.
Would you say that in an ideal functionally differentiated society that all those fields are equal, or should they be all ordered towards a common good, such as maintaining the functional differentiation? And then the second question is, isn't politics the sphere which has as its goal to order society towards the common good?
Yeah.
So then wouldn't that be a higher sphere?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, it's a kind of it's very closely connected to the previous question because it deals with the holism of society, right? So the question, it has actually been a theoretical discussion within social differentiation theory, especially among the Luhmannians in Germany, as to whether all the fields really have an equivalent status. So that's what Luhmann says, right? But there have been other people, such as Uwe Schimank, who thinks that that's not fully the case. Politics does have a wider responsibility for maintaining the general logic of society, right? So that's an ongoing discussion. So that's a good question. And it's a puzzling question, because there is some kind of equivalence between the fields, in the sense that all the fields need each other to function. You cannot have a functional differentiated field on an island somewhere detached from the other functional fields, right? So you need, everything needs to be financed, right? You need economic resources for everything you do. Business needs educated people, so they're all they need information, journalism, so they're all referring to each other. So even though they're separate, they're all interacting and referring to each other, and they need each other. Like, you couldn't have like a half, like if you have a society such as China, which has kind of half the functionally differentiated logic, half the old stratificatory logic of a powerful center, it creates enormous tensions and contradictions. So they actually refer to each other. So that's your question as to, don't they assume the common good, right? The good society. And in a sense they do, because they're all referring to each other, so they kind of implicitly paint the good society.
Because wouldn't the danger be in, if you take it to an extreme, this functional differentiation, the danger is that, well, I guess you already said it, that all the spheres become like technocratic, and then the society in the end is worse off.
Yeah, so Bourdieu was extremely worried about that, democracy being undermined by an exaggerated degree of autonomy, whereas Luhmann thought the more autonomy the better, and there was too much integration in society. So yeah, the question is, remarkably it all sticks together. And I think that the reason, I mean, that's my speculative theory at this point, which I'm trying to formulate. I think the reason it all sticks together is because the functionally differentiated fields are a projection, an outcome of a natural differentiation of virtues in the human condition. So I think that these logics of the fields are actually ethical logics that a human being faces as a human being living their lives, right? So the virtue of truthfulness, right, is distinct from the virtue of bravery, which you could say is a military logic, from working towards the common good, which could be perhaps a political logic. So we have these. So there's a differentiation of virtues, right? It's not that you just have a person who's good. No, a person is good at certain things as certain things, right? So a person could have certain skills and have certain virtues, very strongly developed, and then less strongly developed other virtues, right? So this pluralism is already in the human condition to some extent, and I think that's the key to understanding why there is still integration within society, because as a human being you're still integrated, even though there are all these different virtues which makes claims on you, right?
Yeah, when you talk about virtues, you also talk about the final end, right?
Yeah. So each field, but that's my theory, implicitly or explicitly has a kind of ideal. It has a logic, but behind the logic is an ideal. And totalitarian societies will try not just to have the political field dominate all the other fields in society, but they will also try to work against the pluralism of virtue. So Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un and what's the grandfather? Kim Jong-il. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Kim Il-sung.
Kim Il-sung. Yeah, Kim Il-sung. So Kim Il-sung is the perfect human being in North Korea, right? He's the best golf player. He's the best lover. He's the best politician. He's the best businessman. He's the one who knows most about science and poetry. Like the total human being again, right? So totalitarian societies hate the pluralism of the human condition, because the pluralism of the human condition, the fact that the person can be good at one thing and bad at another thing, itself delegitimizes a totalizing hierarchy. Because as soon as you fully acknowledge the pluralism of virtues, you have to carve up the hierarchies. You can say, in terms of the scholarly hierarchy, this is the tree. But in terms of the golf hierarchy, this is the tree. Like, who's the best golf player? That's separate from who's the best politician, right? So acknowledging the pluralism of virtue is extremely problematic for totalitarian societies. And there you see a glimpse that pluralistic societies are actually anchored in the pluralism of the human condition, which actually brings us back to these Christian theologians in the 19th century, Abraham Kuypers, von Prinsterer, who said that it's a kind of natural order. A natural order intended by God is the differentiated fields, and it's human hubris of totalitarian and revolutionary projects that works against it. So if you take God out of the story and you say, okay, this is not a theological theory, but this is a sociological theory, there is something to the human condition being flourishing to an enormous extent in a pluralistic society because the human condition itself is pluralistic.
I'm always a little bit confused. You had one slide that said complexity leads to unintended consequences. So I'm really interested in how to determine your actions in society. Because if you sit in this car with, let's say, 4 or 5 people having the steering wheel, and you think you have to go to the left side because, whatever, and you steer to the left, but this might lead the car to the right, you can't have any guidance how to make your decisions, how to act. So I'm curious, under what conditions does this complexity model apply to actions in society? And under what conditions can you make sure that if you steer to the left, it might not go completely to the left, but it to a certain degree to the left, and not just to the top or to the right?
So I think that's a general problematic for any player trying to produce any effect in society. And I don't. But apart from that, I don't think you can give a general answer to it. So there are certain things in society which perhaps are a little bit less complex, and you have very competent bureaucrats having a lot of experience can be more certain than in other cases that when they do something it will have the consequences they intended. Whereas in other situations the situation is much less clear. So it depends on what they're trying to do, who is doing it, what are the circumstances. I mean, it's obviously not the case that we have that our state bureaucrats are not incompetent people. They do learn from their mistakes. I mean, the Maoist example I used those are worst examples, right? I think that in the Western societies, our bureaucrats are fairly competent, right? So they learn from their mistakes and they try to do better, and they kind of muddle through. But in the end, we're kind of like in the end, it's extremely difficult or actually impossible to execute any plan that relates to society as a whole. So like systems internally somehow manage things, right? So we can say we want to make this a better university. We want more classes in history. University of Amsterdam can do that. It's internal within the system. But as soon as we say, well, we're going to do something here in the education system that is going to influence the awareness of people in society, that is then going to cause business people to influence politics less, which will then cause political policymakers to, right? As soon as there are steps going to other social fields, the complexity multiplies.
Do you think then that a car with the different people on the steering wheels, the direction the car will take, just as some kind of is a legit direction always?
Well, it depends what the responses are, right? So sometimes the responses kind of move in a direction that was somehow intended, but slightly refracted. Sometimes it goes fully opposite, as with the case of the stratificatory social welfare, right? You have the social welfare policy to help poor people, to redistribute resources in such a way that poor people are less poor. And then actually, because you make the system so complex, middle-class people gain more benefits at the relative expense of poor people. Right? So you can have policies that have the exact opposite effect of what they try to accomplish. But you can also have policies that almost accomplish what they wanted, or policies which slight refractions. But it's very hard to know for the political players what's going on because these refractions also limit your knowledge. So when it comes to improving the quality of education, how are you supposed to know as a politician whether the educational quality is really improving, or the education system is simply adjusting to the quantitative standards set by the state bureaucracy, right? So the funny thing is, if stuff we're doing is not actually working, there's a large chance we wouldn't know it's not working.
Okay, thanks.
Assuming communication is entirely or primarily determined by the functional logic of the field.
Yeah.
Assuming that.
But it
Because
can't-
if you assume that, because otherwise you could have a politician sit down with 100 academics and ask them what they think and go like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm reflexive enough to realize that
Yeah.
what I tried to do was A, but you just explained that the logic of your field is B,
Yeah.
and what's happening is actually C.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, that's great. If that happens,
assuming
then,
this is possible.
that's really great. Those moments are very valuable. But it's hard to play that game because, for instance, bureaucrats, right? It's not that they don't realize that the education system, when they insert output financing, it's not that they don't realize that there is a chance that the education system is simply adjusting to their criteria without actually improving. Hence, in a sense, falsifying their statistics, making that their statistics are not real indications of improvement. But as a bureaucrat, what are you supposed to do? Like, you work with quantitative measures, right? How are you going to measure the actual quality of an education? How are you going to measure the actual quality or the innovative abilities of a university in research, right? You can count papers, right? But one paper is like 100 times as innovative and creative and valuable as another paper. But you can just count papers. That's the only thing you can do. So to the extent that people realize that this happens, but even if they realize it and they can sit down with people and communicate, that's already a big improvement. But then still sometimes you can't get out of it.
Mhm.